7:42 in the morning. The wide body sits out on the gray tarmac, fueled, checked, cleared, and 23 minutes past scheduled push, it hasn't moved an inch. Inside, in the aisle of the first-class cabin, a 67-year-old man stands. He does not sit. He does not step back. His left hand holds a dark canvas bag, corners worn soft since 2003. His right holds a boarding pass, with a number printed clean and black across it. Somebody else is sitting in that number. For words have just been spoken. Quiet. No heat in them. No question in them either. Then he does the thing nobody in this cabin has a script for. He turns away from the seat. He turns toward the room. He looks at them. One face. Then the next. 3 rows back, a phone comes up. Outside the oval window, the fuel cart rolls to a stop. And he uncaps his pen. Gate C-14. Chicago O'Hare. 7:42 in the morning. Calvin Brooks stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, and watched the plane. Not the departures board. Not his phone. Not the 100 small urgencies that airports manufacture for people who can't sit still inside their own heads for 5 consecutive minutes. He watched the plane. It sat out on the tarmac below him in the gray April light like something that had made peace with waiting. Wide body. Already fueled. Already checked. Going nowhere until the humans finished their arrangements and decided it was time. Calvin appreciated that about planes. He could appreciate it in a way that had taken decades to arrive. 21 years flying Air Force cockpits had given him a relationship with aircraft that defied clean description. Love and fear, and deep familiarity compressed by time, into something with no precise name. Just a recognition. A knowing. The way you come to know a face, so well that you stop seeing it feature by feature, and start seeing it whole. The terminal moved around him the way it always did. Everyone going somewhere. Everyone certain their destination was the most important one currently in motion anywhere on the planet. A woman in a yellow coat dragged a suitcase nearly her own height across the polished floor, without slowing down or apologizing. 2 boys chased each other around a charging station in shrinking circles. A man in a gray suit pressed his phone to his ear, and talked about derivatives at a volume that carried 3 gate sections down the concourse. Calvin watched all of it, without being pulled into any of it. He'd worked a long time on that skill. The gift was in knowing which things deserved your attention. And which ones just demanded it. He shifted his weight. His left knee registered the change, with its usual morning report. Not pain exactly. More like the steady, low-frequency awareness of something that had been through a lot, and was still here anyway. 21 years in cockpits not quite sized for a man 6'2" had authored that. Written it into the architecture of him. The knee. The lower back. The way he always, without thinking about it, chose aisle seats. He looked down at his left wrist. The metal band sat where it always sat. Thin. Worn smooth along the top edge, where his watch used to rest, back when he still wore watches. The engraving was still legible, if you looked with intention. Service number. Branch. Year of entry. He'd been 21. Skinny as a fence post. So certain he wanted to fly, that the certainty had outweighed everything else, his mother's long silences, when he talked about enlisting, his father's face, when Calvin told him, the specific loneliness of being the first in your family to go somewhere entirely new, and not having words for, where that somewhere actually was. He'd gone. He'd flown. And when they handed him the chain, with the tag, and everything that came along with it, he'd thought of it as a beginning. It turned out to be several things at once. But he'd brought it back. Every single time. First tour. Second. Third. Back each time to the same woman, who had pressed his hands between both of hers the morning he shipped out for the first deployment, and said 3 words, that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with something deeper. Bring it back. Not come home. Not stay safe. Bring it back. Because his mother understood something Calvin had needed years to fully understand himself. The relationship between a man and the thing he carries into danger is a contract. Not written. Not spoken. Just there. And as long as the thing returns, some essential part of the man has returned along with it. He'd never been able to explain that to anyone who hadn't had a mother like Dorothy Brooke. The overhead speaker came to life. That voice, flat, just warm enough to pass for human. First class boarding, Flight 224. Calvin picked up his carry-on. Dark canvas. Leather handles worn soft at the corners. He'd carried it since 2003. It had been through X-ray machines in 31 states and 4 countries. Examined. Flagged. Held for additional screening in 3 separate airports for reasons that were never explained with any specificity. It still worked. He still used it. Because something still doing its job was not a reason to let it go. He walked to the gate. And before he handed over his boarding pass, he paused. 1 beat. Not nerves. He hadn't been nervous boarding an aircraft since 1981. This was something else. Older. The breath before the door. The habit of a man who had learned, through enough transitions, that mattered, that the space between one place and the next deserved acknowledgement. Whatever's on the other side of this. I'm ready. He stepped through. The flight was going to Los Angeles. 3 hours and 42 minutes, give or take the mood of the upper altitude winds, over the Rockies. He'd be at LAX by noon, if they pushed back close to schedule. His sister Dorothy would be waiting outside arrivals in whatever she drove now, he could never keep track. And Marcus would be with her. 22 years old. His sister's youngest. The kid who had spent 4 grinding years in law school, and called his Uncle Calvin every other week, not to ask for help, but to think out loud. The kid was sharp. Sharper than Calvin had been at 22. And Calvin had been pretty sharp. But Marcus had something else too. Something Calvin recognized but couldn't have named precisely. A quality of stubbornness that wasn't the obstructive kind. The constructive kind. The kind where you don't walk away from a thing you don't understand. You stay with it. Work it. Until understanding either comes, or you've built something in the attempt. Calvin had noticed that quality in Marcus when the boy was 12. It hadn't changed. It had just grown more intentional with age. First law degree in the Brooke family history. The call had come 2 months ago. Marcus's voice low. Trying for casual and not quite landing it. Uncle Cal. I'm walking Saturday. I want you there. He'd booked the ticket that same afternoon. Seat 1A. Chicago to Los Angeles. Aisle. Left side. Front row where available. 30 years of cockpit habits didn't evaporate just because the cockpit was different now. Neither did his back, which had developed strong opinions about window seats on flights longer than 2 hours. The gate agent scanned his pass. He walked down the jet bridge. And at the bottom, before the aircraft door, he paused one last time. The old breath. The old acknowledgement. Then he walked on. The first-class cabin was everything the price implied, and exactly what he'd expected. Quiet. Controlled. The low amber lighting, that made reality look slightly more curated than it actually was. Cool temperature. The soft clink of champagne being poured somewhere forward of him. Leather seats adjusting, with small hydraulic sounds, as passengers lowered themselves into them and became, briefly, people who paid for the absence of inconvenience. Calvin paused inside the cabin entrance. Habit. He did this every time he stepped into a new space. Not long. Not obvious. Just enough. A few seconds to orient. Left side. Right side. Overhead panels. Numbers. He found his. 1A, left cabin. Front row. Aisle. He looked at the seat. And then he saw her. The woman in the cream-colored blazer. She was already settled. That was the word that came to him first, and he stayed with it because it was precise. Not sitting. Not waiting. Settled. The way a person looks, when the question of whether they belong somewhere was answered long ago, and nothing has come along to reopen it. Her handbag occupied the seat beside her. Not balanced there. Not temporary. Placed. The deliberate placement of something that expected to stay. She was looking out the small oval window. Tarmac below. Ground crew in their orange vests moving through their pre-departure patterns. Fuel cart completing its circuit. She wasn't paying attention to the boarding process. And why would she? It was happening around her. Calvin looked at the overhead panel. 1A, he looked at his boarding pass. His name. Chicago to Los Angeles. The seat number printed there in clean black characters. 1A, he walked forward. His steps quiet on the carpet. His carry-on rolling smoothly beside him. He stopped next to the seat, and stood there a moment, without saying anything, because he had learned, over 67 years, that most situations don't need to be rushed into. Most situations become clearer, if you give them a breath first. The woman didn't look up immediately. When she did, her eyes moved the way eyes move, when a decision has already been made, and what follows is only the collection of evidence to support it. Starting at his shoes. Clean. Dark. Nothing expensive about them. Moving to his jeans. His jacket. His face. And in her expression, something settled into place. A closing. Quiet. Certain. Like a door meeting a frame. "Excuse me," Calvin said. His voice level. Unhurried. The voice he'd been using in front of people, who needed to hear things clearly for over 2 decades. "I believe that's my seat." She looked at him. Not at the boarding pass visible in his hand. Not at the seat number on the panel a few inches above her head. Not at anything that might contain information relevant to the question. At him. And then she said it. "You should sit somewhere else." 4 words. That was all. No apology. No question in it. No crack of uncertainty. For words spoken the way you speak something you have never once had reason to revisit. The complete confidence of a verdict that didn't require a trial. Calvin stood very still. He'd heard those words before. Not always those 4. Sometimes they came dressed more considerately. "I think there may be some confusion here, or perhaps there's a better seat further back, or let me just get someone to assist." Same architecture. Different paint. The structure beneath it never changed. "You don't belong here." He'd heard it in offices, where conversations paused, when he entered, and resumed when he found somewhere else to stand. In lobbies where staff smiled the careful smile. In conference rooms, where his credentials sat on the table, and still somehow remained in question, while other people's credentials were simply assumed. In courtrooms where he'd had to build his authority piece by piece in front of rooms that would have given it freely to someone else. He'd heard it for 67 years in its 100 different dialects. This version was direct. Unapologetic. Clear. He felt it settle in his chest the way it always did. Old weight. Familiar and unwelcome. The bruise pressed just enough to confirm it hadn't healed. Behind him, the boarding line had backed up. Someone's carry-on will bump the floor. The champagne clinks continued forward, indifferent. A man murmured something to a woman. Nobody stepped toward him. Nobody said anything on his behalf. The cabin absorbed the moment the way it absorbed everything it preferred not to address. With silence. Calvin looked at the seat number on the overhead panel. Looked at his boarding pass. Looked at her. And then he did something none of them had prepared for. He turned around. Slowly. Deliberately. Not toward the gate. Not toward the back of the plane. Toward the cabin. Toward the people. He turned and he looked at them. One face. Then the next. Then the next. The man in the second row, who had lowered his magazine an inch and a half. The woman in the gray coat, who had glanced up from her phone, and not quite committed to putting it down. The couple by the window, who had leaned their heads together in the silent way couples do, when they want to observe something, without being seen observing it. The older gentleman 1 row back, who had not been reading for at least a minute, and whose attention had a quality unlike anyone else's in the cabin. And the young woman 3 seats back, who had raised her phone, without quite deciding why. Calvin looked at each of them. One by one. Then he spoke. Calm. Level. Not raised. But clear enough to carry the full length of the first-class cabin, without any effort at all. I'd like everyone here to witness what's happening. Nothing moved. Not a glass. Not a hand. Not a breath. Because that sentence didn't exist in anyone's mental script for an airplane. Anger they knew what to do with. Argument they knew how to process. The familiar choreography of a conflict being escalated, and then smoothed over, all of that had choreography. People knew their positions. But a man, who turned to the room, and quietly asked them to pay attention. That had no choreography. The woman in 1A, her name was Margaret Sloane, though Calvin didn't know that yet, and he didn't know her history, or the loss she carried, that would become important, before the flight was done, sat up slightly. Her chin rose a fraction. Her hand moved to her handbag, with a motion that was almost, but not quite involuntary. She had written 2 possible versions of this in the seconds, since he'd appeared in the aisle. First version, he argues, she holds firm, someone comes and handles it. Second version, he takes the easier path, moves, the situation resolves itself. She had been prepared for either. She had not been prepared for this version. The older man 1 row back. Walter Sims. 71 years old. He had spent 38 years in federal law. Civil rights. Employment discrimination. Housing. The slow, unglamorous, essential work of holding institutions accountable for the things they preferred not to be held accountable for. He'd retired 4 years ago, mostly, which in his case meant he no longer billed by the hour, but never stopped watching. His eyes moved between Calvin and the seat, and the woman, and back to Calvin. With speed and precision. The way a mind moves, when pattern recognition activates, before conscious analysis has time to catch up. He knew what he was looking at. 3 rows back, Ava Rourke had been 26 years old for exactly 4 days. She'd booked first class, because it was her birthday week, and she'd decided this year she was going to do at least one thing she'd always told herself she'd do someday. She'd expected it to feel like arriving somewhere. She hadn't expected it to feel like this. Her phone was up. She hadn't consciously decided that. Her thumb rested at the edge of the screen. Not recording. Just. Ready. Across the aisle, Derek Monroe had stopped typing. 43 years old. Corporate Litigation Consulting, New York. He traveled 230 days a year, and had opened his laptop, before the door closed, and had been fully absorbed in a quarterly report, since before the champagne was poured. He had not looked up for any of it. He was looking up now. The man in the aisle. The carry-on in one hand. The boarding pass. And a quality of stillness that didn't fit any category Derek Monroe used professionally, and Derek Monroe's entire professional life was built on categorizing people quickly and accurately. Something half recognized. He opened a browser tab. 2 words in the search field. Calvin Brooke. He hit search, and waited for the airport Wi-Fi to catch up to his curiosity. The flight attendant came from the forward galley. 31 years old. 3 years on this route. The practiced composure that service training builds, the smile that smoothed, the voice that de-escalated, without announcing it was doing so. Her name tag read Claire Moss. She moved quickly. Not running. Never running. Is there a problem here? She asked. And here is where something went wrong. Not dramatically. Not deliberately. Claire Moss was not a bad person. She was not making a decision that felt like a decision. It felt like reading a room. Responding to information. Doing the job she'd been trained to do. Her eyes moved. Cream blazer. Handbag placed just so. The settled composure of a woman who had clearly been in this cabin many times before and expected to be in it many times again. The calm of someone who assumed rooms adjusted for her. Then. The man in the aisle. Standing. Carry-on in hand. Boarding pass visible. Claire's weight shifted by perhaps 10 degrees toward Margaret. Her shoulders angled. Just slightly. Barely perceptibly. But Calvin noticed. He always noticed. He held out his boarding pass, without being asked. She took it. Margaret surrendered her phone, with 2 fingers, the gesture of someone handing over something they're certain about. Claire looked at both. 1 second. 2. It was right there. His seat. Her seat. The wrong number on the wrong person. Plain as anything could possibly be. Requiring nothing except the willingness to say it out loud. Claire looked up. Didn't say it. Handed both passes back. Her grip tightened on the service tablet. Her eyes moved toward the galley. Let me just get the right person to help with this, she said. Calvin nodded. Because he'd heard that sentence before too. Not those words exactly. The movement underneath them. The turn toward procedure, when someone knows the answer, and has found the answer inconvenient. He'd watched it in depositions. In meetings. In rooms where the truth sat undeniable on the table, and everyone suddenly found reasons to study the ceiling. He nodded. And he waited. The boarding door had closed somewhere behind the last passengers. The jet bridge was being retracted. Through the oval windows the tarmac waited in April gray. Ground crew going about their pre-departure work. Everything outside moving forward. Inside. Everything had stopped. Robert Hatch had worked first class for 11 years, before transferring to domestic routes. He was 54. Solid in the way men get who've spent decades carrying authority, as part of their uniform, not performing it, just wearing it, because the weather required. He'd managed drunk passengers and frightened ones. The entitled and the confused. The passengers who believed the rules bent for them, and the ones who'd never heard of the rules at all. He'd handled everything through the same method. Polite. Firm. Fast. Get it resolved. Keep the schedule. He came through the forward curtain, with Claire a half step behind, and assessed the situation in 4 seconds. Cream blazer. Settled. The visible assumption of belonging. Man in the aisle. Standing. Carry-on in hand. Robert had worked first class for 11 years. He knew the look of a situation that wanted to be moved through quickly. What seems to be the trouble here? He said. Calm. Even. Unhurried. His ticket, Margaret said. She didn't turn toward Calvin when she said it. There must be some confusion in the system. There's no confusion, Calvin said. Robert looked at him. The full look, this time. Then held out his hand for the boarding pass. Calvin gave it. Robert examined it. Checked the overhead panel number. Looked at the woman in the seat. Ma'am. Your boarding pass? Margaret gave him the look that said this question was below the level of discourse she expected. She reached for her phone. Held it out at 2-finger distance. Robert looked at the screen. He glanced at Claire. And Claire, barely, almost nothing, a motion that the vast majority of people in that cabin would never have caught, shook her head. Calvin caught it. He was close enough. And he'd been reading rooms like this for 24 years. Robert turned back. Mr. Brooke. He'd read the name. Got the pronunciation right, first try. Your ticket does confirm seat 1A. Yes, Calvin said. However. There it was. The word Robert had been building toward, since he appeared. We have a number of excellent seats still open in first class this morning. In the interest of keeping us on schedule, we'd be happy to. No. Just the one word. No heat in it. No drama. A door, closing. Robert stopped. I understand your position. Do you? Calvin said. Not a question. Not aggression. A request for evidence of the claim. Robert adjusted his jacket. The small professional gesture of a man buying himself a second to recalibrate. We're working within a departure schedule, and there are solutions here that would. I have a valid ticket, Calvin said. His voice stayed exactly where it had been since he stepped onto this plane. Even. Clear. The voice that had carried arguments across courtrooms that didn't want to receive them. For that seat. Specifically. Which that woman is sitting in. With a ticket for a different seat. He looked at Robert. What are you asking me to do? Not a question. The shape of one, but not the substance. Robert held his gaze. The look of a man whose calculation isn't coming out. We're looking for a resolution that works for everyone. The resolution is for her to move to 2C. Just the math. Plain as a bill past due. Sitting in the air between them without apology. Mr. Brooke. Or, Calvin said, and his voice didn't rise, didn't shift, didn't change in any measurable way, you can explain to me, clearly, why the person holding the valid ticket is the one being asked to give something up. The silence that followed had a shape. Robert looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man who knows which number is wrong, but can't bring himself to change it. I'm going to need to involve our captain, he said. That sounds appropriate, Calvin said. And reached into his jacket pocket. The notebook was small. Dark brown leather. Battered at the corners, the clasp worn past catching cleanly. Calvin had used notebooks like this since 1998. He was on his 11th refill. He'd taken it to depositions that ran 4 days, and courtrooms in 11 states, and meetings where the most important thing you could do was have a contemporaneous record of exactly who said what, and in what order. He uncapped a pen. And began to write. The cabin went quiet in a new way. Because nobody had a script for this. Anger had a script. Argument had a script. The man who makes it ugly, and the man who makes it easy, both familiar. both with expected endings. A man standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin writing steadily in a small leather notebook. That was a different story entirely. And nobody knew yet how it ended. Margaret's eyes moved to the notebook, without her permission. She looked away. Looked back. Looked away again, more deliberately this time, which took more effort than the first. Her hands tightened around her handbag. Robert, near the forward galley, consulted his handheld device, with the focused expression of a man doing something routine. He was not doing something routine. Claire had found a tray of service glasses, that apparently required straightening. She was straightening them. One at a time. With the careful attention of someone, who desperately needed something to do, with their hands. They were not the most important things in this cabin. Ava Rourke made a decision. Not a loud one. The quiet internal kind, that you sometimes don't even know you've made, until the moment has passed, and you're still holding the same position. Her thumb moved. The camera opened. She set her hand in her lap, with the phone angled slightly upward. She didn't announce it. Didn't explain it. Whatever was happening felt like the kind of thing, that should exist somewhere besides just her memory. She didn't know exactly why yet. But she trusted the feeling. Across the aisle, Derek Monroe had his search results. He read. His screen bright in the low cabin light. His expression did the thing expressions do, when information is rearranging the context around them, a recalibration at the corners. His eyes going still and then moving differently. He looked up at Calvin. At the notebook. At the pen moving steadily across the page. He looked back down at the screen. Kept reading. In the row behind Derek, Walter Sims watched the cuff of Calvin's jacket. The sleeve had pulled back slightly, when Calvin raised his pen. Just enough. The metal band caught the ambient light briefly. Walter looked at it. The worn surface. The flat engraving. The placement against the inner wrist rather than the outer, that specific way of wearing it, turned in, flush with the skin. He knew what that was. He'd spent 4 years, as a JAG officer, before transitioning to private practice. He'd had clients, who came back, from their deployments wearing exactly, that kind of metal converted to exactly, that kind of band. He'd learned not to ask about it directly. He'd learned to wait, until they mentioned it themselves, which they sometimes did, and sometimes never did. What the band said wasn't complicated. I was somewhere that could have ended me. I came back. I'm still here. Walter picked up his phone. Opened his notes application. And started writing. Because in his experience, you began documenting the moment you understood something important was happening. And he had understood, that approximately 7 minutes ago. When the man in the aisle turned to the full cabin, and asked them to witness. Walter had been asked to witness before. Formally. In professional capacity. He knew what the request cost. To stand in a room, where things were moving against you, and turn to the watching people, and say, without accusation, without volume, I need you to see this. He knew the weight of making that ask. He wrote clearly. Times. Words. The sequence of events. What was said. What was confirmed. What was offered instead of the truth. Old habit. Calvin wrote. He noted the time he'd entered the cabin. The seat number. The woman's exact words. Robert Hatch's offer in the language Robert had used, asking for cooperation rather than acknowledging the simple, inarguable fact that the seat was his. Claire's choice at the moment of truth. He wrote down the order of everything. He'd been doing this, since his first year in civil rights law. A senior partner, 40 years in, had sat across, from him in the conference room, and laid it out plainly, Calvin. The most important thing in this work isn't eloquence. Isn't passion. Isn't even being right. It's documentation. The record that exists independent of memory. Independent of whoever tells the more compelling story. The thing that just is. Whether anyone in the room likes it or not. Calvin wrote without rushing. He was aware of the eyes on him. The specific quality of attention that had settled over the first-class cabin in the last several minutes. He'd been the subject of attention in rooms before, rooms where everyone was waiting to see which way he'd go. Whether he'd argue or step aside. Whether he'd be the kind of man who made it difficult, or the kind who eventually made it easy. He was neither. He was the kind who wrote things down. Robert came back through the forward curtain. The posture of a man who had consulted something or someone and been handed a decision he hadn't chosen, but was committed to delivering. Mr. Brooke. More measured now. I want to assure you we take this seriously. Calvin capped his pen. I believe you also started that sentence with however last time, he said. Robert paused. We've confirmed your seat assignment. He pressed on. And in the interest of keeping things moving, we're prepared to offer you an equivalent or superior first-class seat along with a significant travel credit. You're asking me to move. We're asking for your cooperation. Walk me through the difference. Specifically. Robert held his gaze for a long moment. Mr. Brooke. I need to be direct with you. Please, Calvin said. We have a departure schedule. We have a cabin that needs to be settled. The situation as it currently stands is affecting both of those things. Calvin looked at him. I'm standing still, he said. In the aisle. Next to my seat. He looked at the seat. Then back. She is affecting those things. The sentence was quiet. And it had no counter. Because it was just true. And everyone in the cabin who was listening, which was everyone, knew it. Nobody tried to argue with it. Not even Margaret, who was watching, from the corner of her eye in the specific way of someone trying very hard to appear not to be watching. I'm going to need to involve our captain, Robert said. You mentioned that, Calvin said. Captain Frank Aldridge, Robert said. Directly. Calvin looked at him. Understood, he said. And opened his notebook again. Margaret Sloane was 63 years old. And she had not set out to be the difficult person in anyone's story. The framing would have genuinely surprised her, if someone had offered it. She contributed. She had spent the 16 months, since Edward's death building a foundation in his name, because grief needed somewhere productive to go, and the foundation now gave 2 full scholarships a year to young people, who couldn't have made it, through the training program otherwise. She sat on 3 charitable boards. She had been called, by people who used such words, with care, a woman of genuine generosity. She was not a cruel person. But she had moved through the world in a very particular way for a very long time. A world that had arranged itself around her. Around Edward's name, and her family's name, and the accumulated weight of donations, and connections, and the specific gravity of presence in rooms, where presence carried currency. She hadn't built those walls. She'd inhabited them. For long enough, that she'd stopped being able to see where the walls were, and where she ended. She and Edward had first sat in these seats in the summer of 2001. He'd been appointed to the board of the Airline's parent company that spring. The seats had come as a courtesy. They'd used them every summer after. Even when the courtesy expired, and they were simply paying for the privilege. 22 summers. The flight attendant sometimes recognized her. The seat felt like hers not because she believed she owned it, but because her life had been lived in it for 22 years. Edward had a ritual on this flight. He ordered his drink, before they leveled off, always the same one. He fell asleep reliably by the time they crossed into Iowa. Glasses still on. Head tilted slightly toward the window. She used to carefully slide his glasses off, so they wouldn't leave marks on his nose. She had never been able to explain to anyone why she cared about that. She had. She still did. 16 months. 16 months of learning to be a person, without the person, who had shaped the space around her for 31 years. Of walking into their house, and the silence having a completely different quality than the comfortable silences they'd built together. Of cooking portions that remained too large despite every adjustment. Of reaching for his side of the bed in the early hours, and finding nothing there, and deciding not to move to the middle, because moving to the middle meant admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She had tried to book this flight 8 months ago. Had opened the Airline app, and stared at the screen, and closed it. Had tried again 6 months ago. And 4 months ago. Each time the same result. 3 weeks ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with nothing notable about it, she'd booked it. She couldn't remember making the decision to make the decision. She just remembered that she'd made it. And she had walked onto this plane, and sat in this seat, and she had not thought about who had paid for it. That was the truth. It hadn't occurred to her that the seat might belong to someone in a specific, documented, undeniable way. Because it had always been available to her. Because in her experience it always was. And the distinction between always had been, and always would be had blurred across 22 summers, until the distinction didn't feel like a distinction anymore. She had not thought about the man. And now the man was in the aisle. Writing things down. She watched the notebook, from the side of her vision. The pen moving. The steady, unhurried movement of someone, who was not performing calm, but was actually calm. Which made it harder to dismiss than performance would have been. She reached for her phone. Checked the time. Set it down. Looked out the window. The ground crew was still out there. Everything outside was operating normally. Inside, the clock on the overhead panel read 8:07. 11 minutes past their scheduled departure. Already 11 minutes behind. She had flown this route enough times to know they should have pushed back a quarter of an hour ago. She unclenched her hands. Noticed they had been clenched. Laid them flat on her thighs. She was not in the wrong here. She told herself that. This was a misunderstanding. Fixable. Things like this got sorted. The captain was coming. The captain would sort it. That was how these situations went. That was how things had always gone. But the pen kept moving. And something in her chest said quietly, there are things happening in this cabin, that you don't have the full picture of. She looked out the window. Said nothing. Didn't move. The forward curtain moved. Robert came through first. And behind him, someone different. Calvin heard the footsteps, before he saw the man. The cadence was different. Heavier and more deliberate. The sound of someone, who had been in charge of something large for long enough, that the authority had settled, into the body, the way long-carried weight reshapes the posture. The man stepped into the aisle. Mid-50s. Broad through the shoulders. 4 stripes on the boards. Captain Frank Aldridge. The posture of a man, who was the last word on something significant, and had been for 26 years. Not theatrical. Not imposing in any performative way. Just. Present. Fully occupying the space he was in. He took in the scene, with the practiced efficiency of a man, who made decisions for a living. Cream blazer in 1A. Man standing in the aisle. Notebook in jacket pocket. Carry-on still in hand. Boarding pass still visible. Then the cabin. Ava Rourke's phone at an angle, that registered before Aldridge had consciously registered it. Derek Monroe with his laptop closed, Aldridge had noticed Monroe bored. Monroe was the kind of man, who didn't close his laptop. That detail meant something. Walter Sims in the second row, hands folded, with the specific alert quality of attention that didn't belong to casual interest. Then back to Calvin. "Walk me through what's happening," Aldrich said. And Calvin looked at him. And for one beat, just one, something shifted in Calvin Brooks' expression. Not anger. Not relief. Not even satisfaction. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a man who has been in this exact shape of situation before, in other rooms, with other faces, and who has learned, through years and mistakes, and the patient accumulation of practice, exactly how to stand in it. He looked at Captain Frank Aldrich. "My ticket is for seat 1A, he said. "The passenger currently in that seat has a ticket for 2C. Your crew confirmed both those facts." One deliberate pause. "And then asked me to move." Aldrich's eyes went to Robert. Robert said nothing. The cabin said nothing. Through the oval windows, one of the orange-vested ground crew members had a radio pressed to his ear. The other was looking up at the aircraft. The fuel cart had not moved in 6 minutes. The overhead clock read 8:11. 15 minutes past scheduled push. Walter Sims, in the second row, had not stopped writing. And Calvin Brooks stood in the aisle of Flight 224, with his boarding pass, and his notebook, and his dog tag, not moving, not finished, not anywhere close to finished. Captain Frank Aldrich had spent 26 years managing situations. Not the dramatic ones. Not the incidents that ended up in safety reports, or made news. The real kind. The daily grinding human kind, that pressurized metal tubes at altitude generated reliably, every variety of anger, and fear and grief, and entitlement and loneliness, and urgency that people brought aboard, with their carry-ons. His job was to keep all of it, from becoming something worse than it already was. He was good at it. Which was exactly why this particular situation was bothering him in a way he couldn't quite talk himself out of. Not because it was complicated. Because it wasn't. Because the facts were plain, and anyone who could read could see them, and he had read them, and they pointed in one direction, so clearly that there was no honest way to point in the other direction. And yet, here he was. Prepared to do exactly that. He looked at Calvin Brooks. Calvin Brooks looked back. The man had not moved. Had not shifted his weight, or adjusted his grip on the carry-on handle, or done any of the 100 small unconscious things people do, when pressure is landing on them, and they're trying to decide how to carry it. He just stood. Boarding pass loose between 2 fingers. Expression set to something that wasn't anger, and wasn't exactly patience either. Something older than both. Certainty. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't argue, because it doesn't need to. Aldrich cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks. I've reviewed both tickets." "Good," Calvin said. "Your seat assignment is confirmed. 1A. Yes. And the current occupant of that seat is confirmed, as assigned to 2C. Yes." A pause. The beat of a man stepping off a ledge he'd been standing at the edge of for 30 seconds. In the interest of a smooth departure. "Captain." Aldrich stopped. Calvin's voice hadn't risen. Hadn't changed in any measurable way. But something in it had shifted register. The way a car engine sounds, when it moves, into a different gear, same volume, entirely different quality. "You've just confirmed both those things," Calvin said. He looked at the seat. Then back. "So I want to understand clearly. What exactly am I being asked to cooperate with?" Not a challenge. A question with only one honest answer. And the honest answer, the one that was sitting right there, visible from every angle, was the convenience of a woman who was in a seat that wasn't hers. Nobody said that. The cabin stopped breathing. Not literally. But the quality of the air changed. Because that question had just put everything inside a box, with glass walls, and the walls were transparent, and every person in first class could see exactly what was in the box. Aldridge held his position. 26 years. We're working toward a resolution that. Captain. Still level. Still even. I'm not asking about the resolution. I'm asking what I'm being asked to cooperate with. Specifically. Silence. The thick kind. The kind that occupies space. Robert Hatch, 2 steps behind Aldridge, did something with his jaw. Not quite a response. Just a thing his jaw did, when his brain was moving faster than his face knew what to do with. Claire Moss had stopped touching the service cart she'd been unnecessarily touching for the last 4 minutes. Her hands were at her sides. Still. Like she'd just remembered they were attached to her. 3 rows back, Ava Rourke had not moved her phone. Not down. Not away. Just held it, with the steadiness of someone who has committed to something, and passed the point of reconsidering. And Derek Monroe had finished reading. He set his phone face down on the armrest. With the deliberateness of a man who needs a second. Because the search results had done something to the sequence of events he'd been watching, from across the aisle. Rearranged them. Calvin Brooke. 67. Former Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. 21 years of service, 3 overseas assignments, retired 2000. Illinois Bar Exam 2001, first attempt. Founded Brooke and Associates 2004. Practice areas, civil rights law. Employment discrimination. Housing discrimination. Airline industry practices. Derek had read that last line twice. Because Derek Monroe spent his professional life on the other side of that work. He consulted for corporations managing litigation exposure. He understood the shape of these cases, from the inside. He knew the attorneys who built them. Knew their names. Knew their methods. He had not expected to be sitting 3 feet from one of them on a plane. He had not expected to watch that attorney's case being assembled in real time, in first class, in front of a phone camera that had been running for the better part of 20 minutes. He looked at the back of Calvin's jacket. At Aldridge. At Ava Rourke's steady hand. Said nothing. Because Derek Monroe understood, professionally, when to let a situation develop without interference. Aldridge moved into a different register. Not louder. Firmer. The voice calibrated to be the final word in a contained space, the voice built, over 26 years of being the person situations escalated to. Mr. Brooke. I understand your position. We have a departure window. We have a full aircraft. We have a crew, with obligations to every passenger aboard. His voice stayed measured. Professional. Reasonable. And I'm asking you, as a reasonable man, to accept a resolution that has been offered in good faith. Calvin listened. All the way through. Without interrupting. Then, you described obligations to every other passenger, he said. What's your obligation to me? Aldridge opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. And Margaret Sloane spoke first. She hadn't planned to. She had been sitting in 1A, still her seat in her own thinking, though that particular certainty had been losing altitude for the last several minutes, watching this exchange, from behind the studied posture of someone not watching. She had been waiting for authority to work the way it always worked. The way it had always worked, in every room she'd ever been in. But something was happening to that expectation. Something was wearing it thin. She could feel the cabin. Not just see it. Feel it. The way you feel the temperature of a room change, before you can measure it. The flight attendant, who was no longer orienting toward her. The older man in the second row, who had stopped performing disengagement entirely, and was watching, with the open attention of someone professionally curious. The young woman whose phone had not moved. And the man in the aisle. Still there. Still with the same expression he'd carried, since the first second she'd seen him. Not fury. Not desperation. Not someone making a point. Someone who had decided not to leave. She cleared her throat. "He doesn't understand," she said. Her voice was lower than before. The certainty had gone somewhere. What had replaced it didn't have a name yet. "This isn't just a seat." Aldridge turned slightly toward her. Calvin looked at her. The directness of it surprised her. When she spoke to people in that register, that measured, controlled register, they usually looked at the surface of her. The blazer. The posture. The presentation of a woman who was accustomed to being listened to. He looked at her the way you look at a text you're reading for exact meaning. "My husband and I," she stopped. Steadied. "Edward. We flew this route every summer for 22 years. Always this seat." Her hand moved without authorization. Touched the armrest. "He died 16 months ago. This is my first time back on this flight." The cabin went quiet in a different way. The silence of a standoff, and the silence of vulnerability are two entirely different things. The first one tightens the air. The second opens something in it. This was the second kind. The silence that falls, when someone says something true, and private in a room, that didn't expect it. She looked at Calvin. "I know that's not your problem," she said. "But I thought you should know." Calvin looked at her. He let the silence sit for a moment. Not as judgment. As acknowledgement. The pause you give, when someone has handed you something real, and you want them to know you received it. He knew about grief claiming spaces. Making ordinary objects tender. The kitchen chair that becomes sacred. The specific window. The worn path in the hallway carpet. His father's coffee mug. 11 years on the shelf, and his mother still hadn't moved it to a different cabinet. He understood the geometry of that. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. Margaret blinked. The simplicity of it had caught her somewhere unguarded. "That's a real loss," he said. One breath. "And that doesn't change what's on this boarding pass." Soft. But complete. Both truths held in the same sentence, without apology for either. The grief was real. The ticket was real. Neither one cancelled the other. Margaret looked at him. And something moved across her face. Not anger. Not the composed certainty she'd walked into this cabin wearing. Something that didn't have a name, but pointed, if you followed it far enough in the right direction, toward the beginning of understanding something she hadn't understood before. Which was, it turned out, the most uncomfortable thing of all. And then. Because loss and defensiveness, and 40-odd years of never once having to justify your place in a room are a very specific combination. Because certain phrases live in the body long before they live in the mind. Because. She said it. People like you. Quietly. Not with venom. Not even with clear intention. With the reflex of someone reaching in the dark for something familiar. People like you always need to make everything a problem. It was out, before she'd heard herself say it. And then she heard it. And the cabin heard it. And the silence that followed was not like any of the silences that had come before in this cabin this morning. Because this one had done something that 25 minutes of argument, and professional management, and escalating authority had not managed to do. It had named the thing underneath the thing. The actual architecture of what this morning had been about, from the moment Calvin Brooke walked down this aisle, and a woman looked at him, from shoes to face, and decided she already knew everything about him that mattered. People like you. Not Calvin Brooke specifically. Not the man, with the dog tag, and the notebook, and the 24-year career built in courtrooms arguing for people, who had been looked at exactly the way she had just described looking at him. Not the lieutenant colonel. Not the attorney. A category. Built from a glance. Before a word was spoken. Before a single piece of information was examined. In the time it takes to move your eyes, from a man's shoes to his face, and decide you already know what space he deserves to occupy. Margaret understood in the next 3 seconds exactly what she had said. Her mouth stayed slightly open. Her hand was on the armrest. The certainty was completely gone now. What had replaced it she would have called embarrassment in a less honest moment. But it wasn't only embarrassment. It was the particular sensation of having revealed something true about yourself, that you hadn't known was there. The kind of truth that, once you've seen it, you can't unsee. And you know, with complete certainty, that everyone else in the room has seen it too. Across the aisle, Derek Monroe had picked his phone back up. Not to read. To look at Ava Rourke's camera. Which was still running. Which had been running, since before Margaret had said those 4 words. Which had captured the last 40 seconds in clear, quiet video. Derek Monroe had spent 15 years advising corporations on litigation exposure. He understood what this moment was worth in a courtroom. He understood what it would look like on a screen. He set his phone face down. Looked at the window. Said nothing. The cabin had changed. Nothing dramatic marked the change. Nobody had moved. No voice had been raised. Nothing that could be pointed to, as a single event. But the room had tilted. The way rooms tilt, when something under the surface shifts, and everything on top of it settles at a new angle. The man who had been half-reading 2 rows back was not pretending to read anymore. The woman in the gray coat had an expression, that had lost its neutrality completely. The couple by the window had stopped their conversation, without finding a new one. Even Claire Moss, 3 years of training in maintaining an even face regardless of what was happening around her, had let something get behind the mask. Something she couldn't quite pull back. Margaret sat in 1A, with both hands wrapped around her handbag strap. The grip of a person, whose control of a situation has been slipping, and just felt the slide accelerate past the point of easy recovery. She looked at Robert. Robert looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at Margaret. And said nothing. That was the hardest thing to work with. Not his words. Words could be addressed, countered, de-escalated, reframed. The silence. The specific unhurried silence of a man, who had just been told, very clearly, what another person believed he was. And had decided not to vanish, from the room just, because they'd said it. Walter Sims stood up. He didn't hurry. Didn't announce it. Didn't do any of the things people do, when they're unsure whether they have standing to enter a situation. He just stood. 71 years old. Not as tall as he'd been at 50. But still carrying himself, with the straightness of a man, who had occupied a great many rooms, that mattered and understood, that posture communicated something, before words did. Everyone looked at him. Including Aldridge. "Sir," Aldridge started. "I heard you earlier." Walter's voice was easy. The voice of someone, who had spoken in front of federal judges often enough to have stopped being nervous about speaking in front of anyone else. "I'll be brief." He looked at Calvin first. Not quickly. With intention. The look that said, "I see exactly what this is. I've seen it before. I know what it has cost you to stand, where you're standing." Then he looked at Aldridge. "My name is Walter Sims. I practiced federal law for 38 years. Civil rights work primarily. Employment discrimination. Federal litigation. One beat. I retired 4 years ago. Nobody responded. Walter continued as though they had. I've been in this row since before Mr. Brooke boarded. I have documented, in real time, the sequence of events in this cabin. He held up his phone briefly. Not as a threat. As simple information. Specifically, I've documented the crew's confirmation that Mr. Brooke's ticket is valid, and his assigned seat is 1A. The crew's confirmation that the other passenger's assigned seat is 2C. And the crew's subsequent decision to offer Mr. Brooke relocation rather than ask the other passenger to move. Aldridge's expression did not change. Something behind it did. The smallest recalibration. The micro-adjustment of a man registering that the ground he's standing on is configured differently than he understood. Walter looked at Robert Hatch. He held it. That look. Not harsh. Not confrontational. Just clear. The look of someone who has seen this situation from every possible angle, who has no illusions remaining about what it is, and who is offering one last clear view of it before things get more complicated. Son, he said. Quietly. Without cruelty. The way someone speaks to a younger person, who is in the process of making a consequential mistake, and might still have just enough time to understand what they're doing. What you're doing right now has a name. Robert said nothing. And that name, Walter said, has a case number. The sentence didn't rise. Didn't perform anything. Just sat there in the air between them. Plain and steady. The way a wall just is. Aldridge stepped forward. Sir, I'm going to need you to. I'm sitting down, Walter said. I said I'd be brief. He sat. No drama. Picked up his phone. Kept writing. The cabin held that moment. For 3 full seconds in which no one did anything. Because what Walter Sims had just said had put a frame around everything that had come before it. Not a new frame. The correct frame. The one that had been accurate since the moment Calvin Brooke walked down this aisle, and a woman looked at him and made a decision before checking a single piece of paper. Walter had just said the frame out loud. And once a frame is named in a room that can hear it, you can't quietly unname it. Claire Moss stood near the galley entrance, with her hands at her sides, and her face doing something she had stopped being able to manage about 4 minutes ago. The professional surface was mostly intact. But something had gotten behind it, and settled there. She had known. That was what she was standing with. She had known, from the moment she'd looked at both boarding passes, that Calvin Brooke had the valid ticket, and the correct seat, and the complete and undeniable right to be standing exactly where he was standing. She'd known it in the time it took to read 2 lines of text. And she had turned toward the easier thing. Not once. 3 times. 3 opportunities to say what was true. 3 times she had said something different instead. She had smoothed, and redirected, and deferred, and offered the language of procedure, as a substitute for the language of truth. Walter had just described exactly what that looked like, from the outside. In approximately 4 sentences. She looked at Calvin. Calvin was not looking at her. Which was, somehow, the part that felt most precisely like what it was. Aldridge made a decision. He made it the way men make decisions they know are wrong, but have committed too far to reverse cleanly, with the posture set, and the jaw steady, and the expression of someone who has chosen a direction, and is accepting whatever terrain that direction leads through. Mr. Brooke. Formal now. The softness completely gone. I've given this situation considerably more time than is standard. Calvin said nothing. I've confirmed your ticket. I've confirmed the discrepancy. I've offered you an equivalent seat and compensation. I've been patient and professional throughout. 1 beat. I'm now giving you a direct instruction. The cabin went very still. As captain of this aircraft, I'm directing you to accept the offered seat assignment, so we can begin departure. Calvin looked at him. And if I don't, he said. Not a challenge. A request for the precise terms of what was being said. Aldrich held his gaze. No flinching. Then I'll have no choice, but to initiate removal proceedings. There it was. The line. The final escalation. The sentence designed to be the last word. The words that made someone near the window inhale audibly. That made Ava Rourke's hand tighten fractionally on her phone. That pulled the couple by the window apart slightly, like they needed the space of their own reactions. Calvin Brooke nodded. Once. I understand, he said. Aldrich waited. Because that sounded like the beginning of agreement. It had the shape of it. I understand exactly what you're telling me. Calvin looked at the overhead panel. At the seat number. At Margaret below it. At Aldrich. And I'm choosing not to do it. No heat. No volume. No shift of any kind. Just the fact, landed the same way every other fact had landed this morning. Aldrich straightened. Something hardened in his eyes. And Calvin reached into his jacket. The same slow deliberate movement, as when the notebook came out. But his hand emerged with his phone. And the cabin responded to that motion the way you respond to unexpected movement in a tight space, not panic. Complete, absolute attention. Aldrich stepped forward. Sir. Hold on, Calvin said. Not rude. Just, hold on. He looked at the screen. A contact name. No title. No company. No designation. Just a name, saved the way you save people you actually know. He pressed it. Held the phone to his ear. 1 ring. 2. The voice that answered was a woman's. Calm. Focused. The voice of someone who either expected exactly this call, or was always ready for the kind of call this was. Calvin. I'm on flight 224, he said. Same voice he'd been using all morning. Level. Precise. There's a situation. What kind? My assigned seat is occupied. Crew confirmed my ticket is valid. They're asking me to move anyway. He looked at Aldrich while he said it. Not aggressive. Just present. Captain is involved. Situation has not been corrected. A pause. Shorter than a breath. Are you safe? That question. It landed in the cabin differently than anything else that had been said in the last half hour. Because it wasn't service language. Wasn't procedure. Wasn't the careful professional phrasing of institutional management. It was the question you ask when you actually need to know the answer. Fine, Calvin said. Nothing physical. Just the situation. A brief sound. Not quite a word. Stay where you are. The line went quiet. Calvin lowered the phone. Looked at the screen 1 second. Ended the call. Slipped the phone back into his jacket with the same unhurried motion he used for everything. He looked at Aldrich. I've informed someone of my location and the current situation, he said. That's all. Aldrich looked at him. Who did you call? Someone who needed to know. That's not. It's the answer I have for you right now, Calvin said. Robert Hatch leaned toward Aldrich. His voice low. Not low enough. Captain, we need to. I heard you, Aldrich said. But he was still looking at Calvin. Because something had changed. Not in what was said. In the quality of that call. The 40 seconds of it. The fact that Calvin had not raised his voice, or issued demands, or threatened anything explicitly. Had not performed distress. Had not escalated for the room's benefit. Had simply reported. To someone who had responded by telling him to stay where he was. Someone who had every intention of doing something about it. Aldrich didn't know who. Didn't know exactly what. But 26 years of managing situations had given him an instinct for the moment a situation moved past his ability to manage it. And that instinct was sounding right now in a way it hadn't sounded in years. Outside the aircraft, the ground crew had stopped. The fuel cart, that had been completing its routine circuit, had rolled to a stop 40 seconds after Calvin's phone call ended. Two men in orange vests stood beside it. One had a radio pressed to his ear. The other was looking up at the aircraft, with the particular quality of attention that meant he was waiting for something. Not doing anything. Just waiting. Nobody inside the plane had noticed this. Except Walter Sims, who had a window seat and the 38-year habit of monitoring the periphery while the center of a situation played out. He watched the fuel cart stop. Watched the man with the radio. Noted the angle of his attention. He looked at the timestamp on his notes. 8:19. 23 minutes past the scheduled departure. Walter had been delayed on plenty of flights. Weather. Mechanical. Traffic control. Crew availability. The 100 ordinary reasons that planes stayed at gates past their scheduled time. He had never been delayed because of a seating dispute in first class. But the cart wasn't moving. The man with the radio was listening to something being said on the other end of that radio. Walter set his phone face down on his knee. Folded his hands. Because in his experience, when the machinery around a situation starts changing its shape, it means something on the outside has started responding to something on the inside. And the only thing that had changed on the inside in the last 60 seconds was that phone call. 40 seconds. End to end. And the fuel cart had stopped. Robert Hatch's phone buzzed. He looked at it, with the expression of a man doing something routine. He was not doing something routine. His face did a thing. Small. Controlled. But Claire Moss was standing 8 feet away, and she had been watching Robert's face for 3 years, and she saw it. The color changed around the jaw. The pallor of someone receiving information that arrived without warning. He looked up from the screen. Looked at Aldrich. Aldrich was still watching Calvin. "Captain," Robert said. Low. Deliberate. Each word chosen. Aldrich turned. Robert tilted the screen toward him. Just long enough for Aldrich to read one line. Whatever was on that screen. It was enough. Aldrich straightened. A small motion. But the straightening of a man whose understanding of a situation has just changed scale in a direction he didn't choose, and can't undo. He looked at Calvin Brooke. Calvin was standing exactly where he had been standing when he first stepped into this aisle. Carry-on in one hand. Boarding pass in the other. Dog tag on his wrist. Notebook in his pocket. Expression of a man who was not in a hurry. Who had never been in a hurry. Who had understood, from the beginning, that the only tool this moment required was patience, and had brought more of it than any room he walked into was ever quite ready for. Aldrich said nothing. Robert said nothing. Claire looked at both of them, and felt something shift under something she couldn't name. And Margaret Sloane, in seat 1A, had stopped looking at her phone, the window, her hands. She was looking at the open door at the front of the cabin. At the jet bridge beyond it. She didn't know what she was waiting for. But she was waiting for something. The footsteps started. Not from inside the aircraft. From the jet bridge. Measured. Not quick. Not slow. The pace of someone who is not rushing, because rushing communicates uncertainty. And whatever was coming down, that jet bridge was not uncertain about anything. The sound moved through the door. Through the forward galley. Into the cabin. And the cabin heard it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But the quality of the silence changed again, the way it had changed, when Walter stood up, when Margaret said those 4 words, when the phone was answered on the second ring. The same cabin each time. Each time a different silence. This one was pure expectation. Ava Rourke did not lower her phone. Derek Monroe did not open his laptop. Walter Sims unfolded his hands. Picked up his phone. Waited. Robert Hatch looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at the door. And Calvin Brooks stood in the aisle of Flight 224, with his boarding pass, and his stillness, and the decision he had made somewhere, before he ever stepped, through the gate at C-14. The decision that hadn't required the room's permission then, and didn't require it now. He looked at the door. He breathed. And he waited. Because whatever was about to come, through it had not been able to stay away. And in Calvin Brooks' experience, across 24 years of standing in rooms, that didn't want to hear what he had to say, that was sometimes exactly how things actually changed. Not with the right appeal. Not with someone's better nature. But with consequences, that moved on their own, toward the situation. Ready or not. The footsteps reached the door. Stopped. Aldridge looked at Robert. Robert looked at Claire. Claire looked at the floor. And the door opened all the way. The man who stepped through the aircraft door was not what anyone in that cabin had been imagining. Not because he was unimpressive. The opposite. Because the specific kind of consequence he represented didn't announce itself, with size or obvious markers of authority. He was 61 years old. Medium build. Dark suit, well cut. No tie, and that detail registered first for some reason, the absence of the tie on a man, who clearly didn't forget things. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone, who hadn't rushed to get here, because rushing would have communicated something he had no intention of communicating. Conrad Garrett. Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Air Group. He stepped into the forward galley and paused. Long enough to absorb the room. His eyes moved with efficiency. Reading the scene the way someone reads it, when they've been thoroughly briefed, and are now checking the briefing against reality. Briefings always omitted something. He looked at Aldridge first. Aldridge straightened involuntarily, the physical grammar of chain of command, written into the posture whether you invited it or not. He looked at Robert Hatch. Robert's face did something complicated, and quick that didn't fully form. He looked at Claire Moss. Her hands at her sides. Her face, which was doing something it couldn't stop doing. He looked at Walter Sims, sitting in the second row, with his phone, and his notes, and the open, professional attention of a man, who had already made his determinations, and was now watching to see, if the room would confirm them. He looked at Ava Rourke. At her phone. At the angle of it. He noted all of it, without pausing on any of it. Then he looked at Margaret Sloane. Then he looked at Calvin Brooke. And in his expression, when he looked at Calvin there was nothing that indicated these two men had a relationship of any kind. No recognition. No warmth. No history. Nothing that suggested they had ever been in the same room before. Because they hadn't. Calvin read that in the first 3 seconds. Absorbed it. Filed it. And something inside him, not cold, not disappointed, something clearer than either of those, settled into place. The particular clarity of a man, who has never confused the way the world ought to work, with the way it actually does, and who has built a 24-year career in the gap between those two things. This was not rescue. Not, I came because what they're doing to you is wrong. Not, I came because you deserve better than this. This was math. He could see it from across the cabin. In the posture. In the way Garrett had moved, through the jet bridge. In the 12-minute window between the phone call and the footsteps. Calvin had used the word exposure in courtrooms. Many times. He knew exactly what it did to corporations. What it did to the people in those corporations, who understood what it meant. The word that made legal teams pick up phones. The word that made CEOs board planes that hadn't left the gate yet. He'd used that word deliberately when he called the contact in his phone. Not to a friend. To his co-counsel on Hutchins vs. Meridian Air, Eastern District of Illinois, Phase 2 Discovery, trial date September. The case he was flying to Los Angeles to prepare testimony for, and the case, whose expert witness for the plaintiff was listed in the court documents, as Calvin Brooke and Associates, specializing in documented patterns of differential passenger treatment by cabin class. Garrett's outside counsel had received an automated flag from the airline's internal monitoring system at 8:13. 22 employee shares of an internal video in 9 minutes triggered the alert. And the flag had landed on a desk, where someone immediately understood what it meant. The expert witness in their pending federal civil rights case was standing in a first-class aisle being asked to move to a different seat, while a phone camera captured everything. The call to Garrett had been exactly 4 words. Fix this now. And here Garrett was. Not for Calvin. For Meridian Air. Calvin breathed in. Breathed out. He had explained this arithmetic to clients before. Many of them had wanted something purer. Something cleaner. The moment when someone in a suit looked across the table, and said I was wrong, and I understand, and I'm sorry, without any calculus behind it. He'd had to tell them, gently, every time, that moment is rarer than most people believe. What you can count on is this. When the cost of being wrong becomes higher than the cost of doing right, systems move. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes very slowly. But they move. He'd learned to take the movement. Because the seat was the same seat whether it was given to you freely, or whether the other side finally ran the numbers. He stood where he was. Garrett spoke to Aldrich first. 3 sentences. Low and fast. Aldrich nodded once. Stopped nodding. Stood still with the stillness of someone receiving a verdict. Then Garrett spoke to Robert Hatch. Less than 20 words. Robert's face moved, through multiple expressions too quickly for any of them to settle. Calvin watched all of this from the aisle. Didn't move. Didn't speak. He could read the shape of what was being communicated, without hearing the words. He'd been reading rooms like this for a long time. Not, I came because this is wrong. But, our legal team received a flag, and the flag said exposure, and exposure is the only word in the English language that makes a CEO board a plane. And he was watching it work right now. Garrett turned. Looked at Calvin directly. Something moved across his face. Not recognition of the man, he didn't know Calvin Brooke. Recognition of the situation. The look that comes when someone has been so thoroughly briefed that the person in front of them has already been reduced, temporarily, to the dimensions of a case file. Mr. Brooke, he said. Level. Professional. Not warm. Calvin nodded. Once. Mr. Garrett, he said. Garrett held that for half a second. The fact that Calvin knew the name. Said it without question or surprise. With the ease of someone who had been expecting to deal with this man eventually, and had simply arrived at eventually. Garrett recalibrated almost imperceptibly. The micro-adjustment of someone who thought they had read the room, and is discovering the room is configured differently than assumed. You've had a difficult boarding process, Garrett said. Calvin looked at him. I've had an accurate one, he said. That landed. Garrett blinked. Once. Quick. Professional. I understand. Do you, Calvin said. Not aggressive. Not challenging. The same question he had been asking this cabin for 45 minutes. The only question that mattered. Do you actually understand? Or are you using the word as a container for something else? Garrett didn't answer immediately. Which was its own kind of answer. He turned to face the cabin. Not performing. Assessing. Reading what the briefing had missed. First, Ava Rourke's phone. The angle. Second, Walter Sims, who looked back at him with the expression of a retired federal litigator who has completed his documentation and is now watching to see which direction the situation resolves. Third, the carry-on still in Calvin Brooks' hand. The man had been standing in this aisle for 45 minutes holding that bag. Without sitting. Without moving. Without raising his voice above the register of ordinary conversation. Garrett had read the incident flag. He had had Ava's video described to him in precise terms by the team member, who found it at 8:13, spreading through the employee internal network, 22 shares in 9 minutes, a number his communications team characterized as beyond containment threshold, if it crossed to external platforms. He had read the case number. Hutchins vs. Meridian Air. Eastern District of Illinois. Phase 2 Discovery. September trial date. Expert witness for the plaintiff, Calvin Brooke and Associates. Testifying on documented patterns of differential treatment of passengers by cabin class, and crew response protocols across 17 separate incidents, from 2019 to 2024. Garrett had walked down the jet bridge in 12 minutes. He had not done it for the man standing in the aisle. And Calvin Brooke, standing there with his boarding pass, and his dog tag, and the full weight of 24 years of professional experience in rooms exactly like this one, understood that. The moment he'd read Garrett's face coming, through the door. This was not justice given. This was justice extracted. By consequence. By exposure. By the arithmetic of what it cost a corporation, when the math stopped favoring the wrong side. He'd explained this to clients. He'd had to explain it, because clients wanted the purer version. The version where someone looked at what they'd done, and felt something about it, before the lawyers called. He'd had to tell them, gently, that version exists, but less often than you'd hope. What exists reliably is this: when the cost of continuing to be wrong exceeds the cost of doing right, systems correct. Slowly sometimes. But they correct. He'd learned to accept the correction. Because the seat was the same seat regardless of the reason it finally became available. He breathed. And stood where he was. Garrett spoke. Directly. Without the professional cushioning that had characterized Robert Hatch's approach, and Frank Aldridge's approach, and every institutional response to this situation for the last 45 minutes. He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am," he said. "I need you to move to your assigned seat." Margaret looked at him. She had seen something coming. In some part of herself, that had been processing the last 15 minutes, from behind the controlled surface, she had understood that the shape of this situation had changed in a way that wasn't changing back. That whoever was walking down that jet bridge was not coming to make her comfortable. "Your ticket is for 2C, Garrett said. "Please gather your things." Not unkind. Not kind either. Just clear. Margaret looked at Calvin. Then at Garrett. Then at the seat below her. The armrest she had been touching for the better part of an hour. The oval window, that showed the tarmac, and the stopped fuel cart, and the gray morning light, that looked exactly the same as it had when she sat down. She gathered her things. It took approximately 30 seconds. The handbag. The small travel pouch she'd tucked into the seat pocket. The reading glasses she hadn't used. She collected them the way you collect things, when your hands are doing the work, and the rest of you is somewhere else entirely. Then she was standing. In the aisle. Garrett spoke to Robert Hatch, without looking away, from the general space between them. Written report. Both of you. He meant Robert and Claire. Both of them, clearly. Full account of the sequence, from the moment Mr. Brooke boarded. Submitted by Wheels Down. Robert nodded. The sharp nod of someone projecting competence at the exact moment that competence has been definitively called into question. Claire said nothing. Nodded once. Garrett turned to Aldridge. Your decision-making in this situation will be reviewed by our legal team. You'll receive a contact within 24 hours of landing. Aldridge held his posture. His face was the face of someone absorbing a judgment that cannot be argued with. Not now. Possibly not ever. Understood, he said. Garrett nodded. Then he stepped to the side of the aisle. Because there was someone who needed to pass. Margaret walked. Each step measured. Not the stride she'd carried down this aisle 90 minutes ago, the easy, unhurried stride of a woman for whom this space was familiar territory. Something quieter now. More careful. The walk of a woman paying attention to the ground under her feet for the first time in a while. She reached Calvin. Stopped. He was right there. 3 feet. The man she had looked at, from shoes to face, and dismissed before he said a word. The man she'd told to sit somewhere else. The man who had stood in this aisle for 45 minutes, without raising his voice once, without moving once, writing in a small notebook, while everyone around him calculated the easiest way to make him go away. She looked at him. At his face. Really looked. The way she should have looked the first time. Not the looking, that collects only what it's already decided to find, but the other kind. The kind that arrives, after the positions have eroded, and the defenses have used themselves up, and what remains is just 2 people in an aisle, with everything that happened between them sitting there in plain sight. I didn't know who you were, she said. Low. Barely carrying past the space between them. And she was aware even, as she said it, that it wasn't an excuse. She could hear that it wasn't. She said it anyway, because it was the most honest thing she had left, and she needed to offer something honest. Calvin looked at her. Nothing in his expression was performance. Not satisfaction, the man, who wins something, and wants the other person to understand they've lost. Not resentment. Not the charitable forgiveness, that would have required him to put a frame around what she'd done to make it easier to carry. Just recognition. The clear, undecorated look of someone who sees exactly what a thing is. That, he said, was never the problem. Margaret held those words. She held them the way you hold something that isn't finished doing what it's going to do to you. That is going to take a while. That you'll be unpacking in quiet moments for longer than you'd choose. She nodded. Once. And walked. 2 rows back. The seat number she had been assigned. The seat that had been hers in the most literal, documented, undeniable sense since the moment she bought her ticket. The seat she had chosen not to occupy. She sat down in 2C. Did not look back. Garrett looked at Calvin. Your seat is 1A, he said. The simplest possible version of the statement, that should have been made 45 minutes ago. Calvin looked at the seat. Then he stepped forward. He lifted his carry-on into the overhead compartment. Closed the bin. Turned. Lowered himself into seat 1A, with the economy of movement of someone who has inhabited many difficult spaces, and learned not to waste motion inside them. He sat. No exhale of relief. No visible expression of anything. No look toward the rows behind him, where people were watching. No acknowledgement of the shift in the cabin's temperature. He just. Saturday. He folded his boarding pass once. Put it in his jacket pocket. The notebook was in the other pocket. The dog tag was on his wrist. He was 67 years old. He was sitting in seat 1A. He was on a flight to Los Angeles to watch his nephew receive the first law degree in the Brooke family's history. That was what he had come here to do. And now he was going to do it. Garrett remained in the aisle a moment longer. He looked at the cabin once. At the passengers, who were no longer performing disengagement, and hadn't been for some time. Who were watching, with the direct attention of people, who understand they have been present for something, that will stay with them. He said nothing to them. He didn't need to. He walked to the forward galley. Spoke briefly to someone, who had appeared there, a ground operations member, radio in hand, who had been waiting for the word. A few sentences. The radio crackled. Garrett walked out, through the door, and back up the jet bridge. Outside the window. The fuel cart began moving again. The aircraft door closed. Not with ceremony. Just the standard mechanical seal of a properly closed door. The same sound on every departure. Routine. Ordinary. In this cabin, at this moment, it landed like the period at the end of a very long sentence. Robert Hatch disappeared behind the forward curtain. Claire Moss began pre-flight preparations. Moving through the sequence, with the focus of someone, who needed procedural motion right now. Something that had steps, and didn't require her to hold a sustained thought. The thought was there anyway. It didn't need her to hold it. It held itself. Aldridge returned to the cockpit. The door closed. And through the walls of the aircraft the sounds of systems coming to operational life began to fill the silence that the humans had left behind. Ava Rourke looked at her phone. The video was 46 minutes long. She had started it, with her thumb in a condition of uncertainty, and had never committed to stopping. Now she had 46 minutes of a first-class cabin in, which a man had stood still, and refused to disappear, and the entire institutional weight of the situation had eventually had to rearrange itself around him. She watched the last 30 seconds. His profile. The aisle. The boarding pass. The quality of stillness, that she now understood was not the absence of feeling, but something much harder to build. She watched Margaret stop in the aisle. The thing Margaret said. And Calvin's face when he answered. She sat with it. For a minute. Maybe more. Trying to determine what caption was equal to what she had witnessed. What framing was honest. What she owed the moment. Nothing complicated came. Nothing that needed crafting. One sentence. She typed it. This man didn't raise his voice once. She posted it. Set the phone face up on the armrest. Watched the screen for a moment. Then put the phone in her bag. Because some things didn't need to be monitored. They just needed to be released. Derek Monroe did not open his laptop. He was going to. He had a quarterly report. 2 pitch documents. An inbox running at 40 emails an hour. A meeting in Culver City at 3 o'clock. The flight to Los Angeles was not a vacation, and had never been treated as one. He knew all of that. He was still sitting, with his laptop closed, and his phone face down, and his hands in his lap. Because Derek Monroe spent his professional life advising companies on what situations cost. What evidence meant in context. What the gap between stated values and operational behavior looked like when it was documented in real time. He had just watched that gap. For 46 minutes. He had watched a crew confirm that Calvin Brooke had the right ticket and the right seat. And then ask him to move anyway. Not in anger. Not in hostility. In the quiet, practiced, automatic assumption that some people fit certain spaces, and other people needed to be redirected towards somewhere more suitable. He had watched Walter Sims stand up and name it. He had read the search results. He had watched a CEO walk down a jet bridge in 12 minutes, because the math on the wrong side finally came out bad enough. And he was sitting, with a thought he didn't particularly want to sit with. How many of those decisions have I been part of? Not in aviation. Not about seats. The same geometry. The same automatic calculation, that happened before anyone said a word. Built from something other than the facts. He didn't have a number. The absence of a number was itself information. He opened his laptop eventually. Because the 3 o'clock meeting was going to happen regardless of what had happened in this cabin. Because the quarterly report existed independent of his feelings about it. But before he typed anything, he looked at the back of Calvin Brooks' seat. 1 second. Maybe 2. Then he worked. But he was not quite the same person, who had sat down 2 hours ago, and opened the laptop, without looking up from it. Some things change you all at once, and you know it in the moment. Other things change you by 1 degree, and you only understand it later, when you notice you're standing differently, and can't quite remember, when that started. Derek Monroe suspected he was in the second category. And that was probably fine. The aircraft pushed back. The gentle backward slide away from the gate. The terminal beginning to move past the windows. The jet bridge retracting, from what had happened here, and returning to its ordinary purpose of connecting one space to the next. The engines built. Calvin looked out the window. The tarmac moved. The geometry of an airport in motion, taxiways, and signals, and the careful choreography of aircraft finding their departure routes. He knew this airport. He'd flown out of it hundreds of times. In uniform and out. In cockpits and cabins. On jump seats, and passenger seats, and once on a military transport, that smelled like diesel, and cold metal, and something he'd never been able to name. He knew this sky. He looked at his left wrist. The dog tag band in the window light. The worn surface. The year in the engraving. He'd been 21. Certain of one thing. And that one thing had held. Across 46 years of rooms that tested it. Through the deployments, and the law school evenings, and the bar exam, and the early cases, and the ones that went badly, and the ones that went well, and the long middle stretch of building something real in a field, where nothing came easily. The certainty had held. That he had a right to be in the rooms he entered. Every room. Whether they were ready for him or not. He had never been given that certainty. Had not inherited it. Had not received it in any ceremony, or credential, or verdict. He had decided it. At 21. On a tarmac colder than this one. With a bag at his feet, and everything uncertain except the thing he had made certain himself. And he had carried it in. Every time. Somewhere over Iowa, at 31,000 feet, Claire Moss stopped doing what she was doing. She had been doing things for 2 hours. Drinks. Headphones. Blankets. Service items. The mechanical maintenance of the routine, that structured her working hours and, on days like this one, gave her hands somewhere to be, while the rest of her worked, through what her hands couldn't address. She had served Calvin Brooks once. Water. Standard. He had said thank you. She had nodded, and moved to the next row, and concentrated very hard on the next row. She had been avoiding a conversation for 2 hours. She was done avoiding it. She walked to 1A and stopped. Calvin was not asleep. He was looking out the window at the cloud layer below them. The pale Iowa sky. The suspension of being between places, that long flights created. He turned when she stopped. He looked at her. And she said, "Sir. I need to say something." Not service language. Not a professional phrase. Just the sentence of someone, who has been carrying something for 2 hours, and has decided to put it down. Calvin waited. Didn't help her. Didn't offer anything. Just waited. The way you wait, when you understand that what someone needs is to say it themselves, and the saying is the point of the exercise. I knew, she said. A beat. I looked at both boarding passes. I knew immediately. She had decided, before she walked over here, to be steady. To not perform distress, as a way of making this about her feelings. And I chose the easier thing. Silence. 3 times, she said. I had the chance to say what was true. And 3 times I said something else instead. Calvin looked at her. For a long moment. The assessment was not harsh. Was not forgiving either. Forgiveness would have required putting a frame around what had happened to make it easier to carry, and she hadn't come here for that. It was the careful, complete attention of a man who has made it his practice to see people clearly. Yes, he said. 1 word. No elaboration. No absolution. No, I understand the pressures you were under, these things happen, don't be too hard on yourself. No softening of any kind. Just the confirmation. Because she hadn't come for comfort. She'd come for the truth. And a man, who had spent 24 years fighting for the right to be seen clearly, could at least give another person that same thing. Even when it wasn't comfortable. Especially then. Claire nodded. Once. She looked at him for 1 more second. Then she turned, and walked back toward the galley. The posture of someone who has set something down, and is still adjusting to what it feels like to walk, without the weight of it. She would figure that out. It was for later. Margaret Sloane sat in 2C, and looked out the window at the clouds below. The same clouds. Obviously. The seat was 30 feet, from where she'd been. The altitude hadn't changed. The view was essentially identical. She sat with that. The clouds the same. The sky the same. The speed and the altitude, and the destination all the same. Everything that actually mattered about this flight was the same, from this seat, as it would have been, from the other one. And she had needed, or had believed she needed, and believed it, so thoroughly that the belief had done all the work of actual need, she had needed the other seat. The armrest with the specific worn texture she associated with Edward's elbow. The exact angle of the window he had always slept against. The positioning of the tray table she had memorized across 22 years, without trying to. She had needed the place. Not the journey. And she had walked onto this aircraft, and occupied that place, without asking, and had sat in it, while a man, with a valid ticket stood in the aisle, and she had told him to sit somewhere else. She breathed. The memory arrived the way memories arrive, when you've been holding a door closed against them, and the door finally gives. Chicago to Denver. A promotion dinner. Edward had been named regional director at 39, younger than anyone had expected, and he had known it, and it had mattered to him in ways he didn't always have direct language for. He'd bought first-class tickets for both of them. First time. She remembered him looking at the tickets outside the gate, quiet for a moment in a way she'd recognized even then, as something beyond simple excitement. He'd told her on the plane. Somewhere over Kansas. He'd told her about walking down the aisle to his seat, and the man, older, corner of the cabin posture, the practiced ease of someone for whom this cabin was the expected environment, who had looked at Edward, from shoes to face. Without saying a word. The look. The one that said, "You. Here." Really. Edward had sat down. He hadn't argued. Hadn't confronted the man. Hadn't done anything except exactly what his ticket said he had the right to do, which was take his seat, and fly to Denver. But the look had followed him, through the flight. He hadn't been able to shake it. He'd told her later that night. After the dinner. In the hotel room, with the city laid out below them in lights, in the glow of something that should have felt entirely celebratory. He'd told her, and she had held his hands across the table, and said, "Good. You had every right to be there." She had meant it. Completely. Without reservation. She had understood what it meant, the specific weight of carrying your right to be in a room everywhere you went, displaying it to every new space like a credential, that other people never had to show. She had understood the exhaustion of it. She had been proud of Edward for sitting down anyway. She had told him he was right to stay. And then 35 years had passed. And she had become the man at the aisle. Not with his suit. Not with his particular corner of first-class practiced comfort. She had her own version. Her own set of assumptions about which spaces opened for her, without requiring her to justify her presence. Her own credential, invisible because it had never needed to be visible. Because it had always, without effort or thought, been assumed. She looked out the window. The clouds below her were the same clouds, from every altitude. She thought about Edward. About the look he had described. The one that said, "You. Here. Really." She thought about what her own face had done, when Calvin Brooke walked up the aisle of this aircraft this morning. She didn't want to think about it. She thought about it anyway. Because she had promised Edward, at the hotel table in Denver, with the city lights below them, that she understood. That she knew what it cost. That she would always know. She had understood in theory. She had not understood in practice. And now she did. At 63 years old, in Seat 2C, at 31,000 feet, over Iowa, she finally understood the thing she had been certain she already knew. The cost of a glance. The weight of the quick, automatic decision. The cruelty, not intended, not dramatic, just real and consequential, of looking at a person, and deciding who they are, and what space they deserve, before you've received a single piece of information about them. She had done that. To a man, who had served 21 years in the United States Air Force. Who had earned a law degree, while in uniform. Who had spent 24 years in courtrooms fighting for people, who had been looked at exactly the way she had looked at him this morning. Who had stood in a first-class aisle, and refused to disappear from it because he understood something, that took her 63 years to understand at the level of the body rather than just the mind. That you have a right to be in the rooms you enter. And no glance gets to take that from you. She pressed her fingers against her mouth. Not to hold something back. Just to hold something. She did not cry. Not here. That reckoning belonged to the private hours, that would come later, in the quiet of a house, that was still learning the difference between empty and peaceful. That kind of understanding needed space to breathe. For now she just sat. With the knowledge. With the weight of it. With the beginning of something she would spend a long time figuring out how to live differently because of. It wasn't enough. She knew that. Understanding was not the same as making it right. Understanding was just the beginning of the longer work. But it was real. And it was hers now in a way it hadn't been this morning. She looked out at the clouds. And they were the same clouds they had been, from the beginning. The aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles. The engines shifted tone. The nose tilted forward. The world below began to resolve, from abstraction into detail, the geometry of the basin from altitude. Highways like threads. Neighborhoods fitting together. The particular boundlessness of a city that had never learned to stop. Calvin put his notebook in his jacket pocket. He had written through most of the flight. Not about the cabin. Not about what had happened this morning in any direct way. He had written to Marcus. He'd been composing it since somewhere over Missouri. Since the plane leveled off, and the cabin found its flight mode quiet, and he had looked out the window, and thought about a 22-year-old in a graduation robe, who was about to walk across a stage, and receive something the Brooke family had never held before. He'd written it the way older men write to younger ones, when they have something real to give, and the words available don't quite have the precision the thing deserves. About carrying your right to be in a room. About how the law was a tool. A good one. One of the best ever made. But a tool. And tools required you to keep holding them, when rooms got uncomfortable. Required you not to set them down at the moment they were most needed, because that was also usually the moment they were heaviest. About standing still being an act, not a concession. About the promise he had made to himself at 21 years old on a cold tarmac, in the dark, with a bag at his feet, and a service tag in his hand, and everything uncertain except one thing. About keeping that promise imperfectly across 46 years of rooms, that tested it. About how the keeping of it hadn't always looked like winning. Had sometimes looked like standing in an aisle for 45 minutes, while the room calculated how to make you disappear. About how some things are won not by force, but by ground you refuse to give up. He closed the notebook. The descent continued. Los Angeles International. The aircraft touched down, with the clean, decisive contact of a runway meeting a machine that has done this 10,000 times. The deceleration. The turnoff. The slow taxi toward the gate. Normal. Routine. Every flight ending exactly like this. Except in the first-class cabin of Flight 224, the air still carried something that ordinary landings don't bring with them. Nothing visible. Nothing that could be pointed to or labeled. But the passengers, who rose and reached into overhead bins, and moved through the standard urgency of arrival were not quite the same people who had sat down at gate C-14 in Chicago. Some things change you all at once, in the moment. This had been one of those. Claire Moss was working the exit. When Calvin reached her, she met his eyes. Didn't speak. He didn't speak. But she held it, the eye contact, one beat longer than she would have yesterday. One beat longer than she would have an hour ago. Something in her face, not peace, not resolution, but the beginning of the honest accounting, that comes when you see your own outline clearly in a day. He passed her. Walked up the jet bridge. Into the terminal. And into the ordinary machinery of arrival, the luggage carousels, the meeting crowds, the particular mixed quality of exhaustion and anticipation that airports hold near their exits. Marcus was at the bottom of the escalator. 22 years old. Taller than Calvin remembered, or maybe just standing differently. The posture of someone who has done something significant, and is letting it settle in the body, before deciding what it means going forward. He had the slightly dazed quality that graduation days produced. The look of a person whose entire framework has just reorganized, and who is standing in the new geography of themselves figuring out where the landmarks are. He saw Calvin. And what crossed his face wasn't complicated. Just relief. The relief of someone who had wanted one specific person to be present for something important, and now that person was here. They embraced the way men embrace, when they care about each other, and don't have a language for it, that isn't physical, firmly, briefly, then the arm around the shoulder, then walking side by side, because standing face to face is for conversations you're ready to have, and walking side by side is for everything else. How was the flight? Marcus asked. Calvin looked at him. Considered the question. Interesting, he said. Marcus laughed. The laugh of someone who knows their uncle well enough to know that interesting was carrying significant weight in that sentence. That interesting was doing a lot of work. That there was probably a story. That the story would come when it was ready, and not before. They walked through the terminal. Marcus talked about the ceremony. The moment they called his name. The specific way his mother's face had looked, from his position in the third row, which had required him to look at the ceiling for a few seconds to get himself back. He talked about his study group, who had been in the seats behind his family. About the professor, who had shaken his hand, after and said something Marcus didn't repeat, but which had clearly meant something. Calvin listened. All of it. At the sliding doors, that led to the California outside, Marcus looked at Calvin's wrist. The dog tag band. He'd seen it 100 times. His whole life, practically. But something about today, maybe the graduation, maybe the age he had reached, the age where you start to see the people, who shaped you, as whole people rather than just the portions they directed at you, made him stop. Uncle Cal. Calvin looked. What is that? He looked down at his wrist. The worn metal. The year. The 46 years of mornings it had been in this position. A reminder, he said. Marcus waited. Of what? Calvin looked at it for a moment longer. Then at his nephew. That I was somewhere I was supposed to be, he said. No matter who told me otherwise. Marcus held that. The way 22-year-olds hold things, when the weight of them is clear, but the category isn't, yet, when you know something matters, before you know exactly why. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket. The notebook. He held it out. Marcus looked at it. Looked at Calvin. Inside, Calvin said. Something I started writing this morning. It's for you. Marcus took it. Slowly. With both hands. The way you take something, when you understand it is more than what it looks like. Read it when you get to your first hard day, Calvin said. Not before. Marcus nodded. No questions. Because some things don't need questions. They need to be received, and carried until the moment they become necessary. And then they open on their own. They stepped through the sliding doors. The California light came at them. Warm. Wide. The brightness of a city that never apologized for itself. The smell of jet exhaust, and dry air, and eucalyptus from somewhere unseen. Calvin walked into it. The same man, who had stood in a first-class aisle for 45 minutes, and refused to move. Who had turned to a cabin full of strangers, and asked them to witness. Who had opened a notebook and written clearly. Who had made a call. Who had said no to every offer, that was a substitute for the simple, inarguable thing he was owed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just. Steadily. The way you say what needs saying, when the room doesn't want to hear it. The way you hold the ground, that needs holding, when everything around you is working to redirect you somewhere else. The way you carry, across 46 years, and every room, that tests it, the decision you made at 21 years old in the dark on a cold tarmac, with a bag at your feet. I am somewhere I'm supposed to be. The dog tag caught the light. The notebook was in his nephew's hands. The letter inside it would wait for the first hard day. And there would be one. There always was. That was the thing nobody told you, and everybody eventually learned. There was always going to be a first-class cabin somewhere in your life. Always a moment, when a room looked at you, and made its quick quiet calculation. Always a choice between the easier thing, and the accurate one. Between the seat, that someone offered you, and the seat you actually paid for. The letter wouldn't make that easier. Nothing made that easier. But it might remind a 22-year-old, with a law degree, and his whole life's work still in front of him, that the decision had already been made by someone, who came before him. And by the person before that. By every man and woman who had stood in a room, that didn't want them there, and had stayed anyway. Who had taken the seat. Who had held the ground. Who had carried the weight of their own belonging, into every space they entered, and refused, when it was hardest, to set it down. By every person, who had decided, quietly, before the room was watching. I am somewhere I'm supposed to be. And I'm not leaving.